Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial. Chapter 32, Wheelock's Latin. The topics in this chapter are the formation and comparison of adverbs, the verbs volo, malo, and nolo, and so-called proviso clauses. In my view, this chapter boils down to knowing the vocabulary. As your book points out, we can form and make comparison of adverbs using, in many cases, our knowledge of adjectives. And you can see here, as your book points out, that we have our most common first and second declension adjectives ending in us, a, and and we simply add an e to that base or stem, and that gives us our adverb. We also have adjectives in the third declension, and in the case of adverbs formed from adjectives in the third declension, we add iter. So knowing our vocabulary and to what species or declension adjectives belong to will help us a great deal. But in the end, just knowing the vocabulary, I think, will take us a long way in being successful on this topic. We also can form adverbial phrases and expressions using quam, which is very common in Latin. So here's a good example. Simply means then, so it functions as a comparison in this particular instance. Hic puer colerius concurrit quam ille. This boy ran more quickly than that one, and then the same example using girl instead of boy. This collection of adverbs probably needs to be memorized or just practiced a lot, and some combination of both. But we'll see how these are used in context in our sentences, and you'll discover they're not too tricky once we know the vocabulary. So as always, make sure you read through this chapter before tackling the exercises so you have some background conceptual knowledge of the sententia antiqui. Another topic in this chapter is the verbs. Just to go back to the topic here, volo, malo, and nolo. Volo means I want, malo means I prefer, nolo means I don't want. As you'll see in the examples we have, this topic is also not too tricky. And many of the examples are quite simple as far as Latin goes. So we'll want to take a look at how to form or conjugate these verbs as well. And we'll take a look at that in the examples. And the last topic is so-called proviso clauses, often introduced with this word here, do modo, which means provided that, and then the negative form using ne. Again, once we look at the examples, you'll see this one is not too tricky despite, the rather perhaps unfamiliar description of the topic. Here's a couple good examples of proviso clauses. Non timido de modo hic remanias. We are using the subjunctive form here, but in one sense, that's not necessary in order to be successful with this sentence. Here's our bo be be boo. I will not be afraid, or I shall not be afraid, provided that. There's the dumo. You remain here. As your book points out, even though we have the verb in the subjunctive, it says the verb, just reading down here, the verb in such clauses is simply translated as an indicative. So in other words, just how we normally would think of language. So it's in the subjunctive, but we often translate it using the indicative as the main mood. And then here's our vocabulary. We don't have a lot of vocabulary because the book wants us to memorize and to learn, this group of adverbs, again, which are often based on adjectives. So hopefully many of these words and roots look familiar. Let's jump right into the examples here. And I think you'll agree this chapter is fairly straightforward as far as Latin goes at this point. So, unos occasio non facile praebitur, sed facile ac repente amititur by Publius Syrus. This, of course, is where we get the word occasion. And I have our Whitaker's words up here just to give us a couple of other options here. So occasion, pretext, chance, or opportunity. Actually, maybe all of these except chance would work in this context. I'm going to keep it rather literal, although opportunity might function somewhat more idiomatically in this case. But let's go ahead and write that down. As we mentioned many times, I think one of the virtues of Latin is, like in serious learning and research, slowing it down. So let's go ahead and write that down, just so we have that. And then non facile, that is not easily. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down as well. As you can already tell, I'm probably going to have to reposition the word order by putting the verb between the subject and the negative in this particular instance, but I'm just showing you how it's probably best to tackle Latin one word at a time. And here's our verb in this case, praebitur, which is one of, and notice before I look at the vocabulary, notice that it's in the passive, aristur, murmurinuntur. So this is a good chapter for you to tidy up your conceptual understanding of Latin. And you can see here, this is present passive indicative. And here's our options. You can see once again, we have to kind of, based on the context, see which one works best. In this particular case, maybe you provide an occasion or you provide an opportunity. Render, although that might seem overly literary, but once again, looking at the, I don't think you would use occasion again, that would be redundant. So let's go with provide or produce or render. I'll just go with provide since that's the definition our book gives us. So the occasion is not provided, and the occasion is not easily provided. So I'm going to go ahead and revise that word order as I go from Latin to English. But, and then here's our adverb. We have actually two adverbs. So if you see a word ending in E, just to kind of go back to basic concept work here, you can see our positive adverb E, 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 and then we simply translate this often as our adverb ly, which we learned back in grammar school. Here's some irregular ones. In fact, this is one of our words in this particular example. You can see it means easily. So let's just go with that. So we go back to the example here. But it is easily and quickly lost. Amitor literally means sent away. So amititur, sent away. So if we look this up, let's see, how do you spell this here? Okay. Nope. Oops. There we go. Waking up, drinking a cup of coffee as we speak. So it's early morning here. Sun's not even up, as a matter of fact. So here's our present passive indicative, third person singular. Lose by death. I don't think it means that. Send away, dismissed, parted with would also work. I'm just going to keep it simple and say lost. And since we have the Whitaker's words rather open, let's go ahead and look up repente. In fact, suddenly or unexpectedly. So let's go ahead and change that slightly just to be more consistent with our learning tools. The occasion is not easily provided, but it is easily and suddenly lost. All right, so that's how you work your way through that one. And again, once upon a time, I had to do the same thing. Obviously, now I wouldn't need to, look up words and things like that. I would have some sense of what I'm reading at this point. But I think this is one of the virtues of these video tutorials, is to show you how to learn without simply just using Google Translate and not really understanding anything. As with most things, you got to take your time. You got to look up words in a dictionary. You need to make sure you understand the concepts. And then once you have the vocabulary and the concepts, you need to, okay, how do I put that into sound English? And with a little bit of time and effort, you'll be successful in that. All right, let's take a look at the next one here. Nobis convivere iam diutius non potest noli remanere id non ferimus. So here's our subject and verb. You are not able to live with us now any longer. Don't remain. We will no longer tolerate you or literally endure you. So here we have Cicero, no doubt, once again, a reference to his famous critique of Catiline, which we've seen many, many times in the Wheelock's Latin. And so let's go ahead and write this one down. So here's our subject and verb. So I'm going to start with that this time, because often we do in English. And then iam diutius literally means now any longer. So here is one of our irregular forms of, in fact, they probably have this one in here. So before technology and Whitaker's words, you had to look stuff up. And let's see if they have this one here. Yep, right down here. Oops, kind of highlight. So there it is. And then iam means any longer. In this case, or now no longer, is kind of how it idiomatically works there. So go back to the example here. You are not able to live with us now any longer. Go and write that down. You see I haven't changed it in the translation. That's how translation works. It's a process of creativity. So literally, with us, to live now, longer, not able. So you, s, are not able, non potest, to live any longer with us. So if you want to move that around, that's fine. And then here's our negative form of the imperative, don't stay. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. And then this one's actually in the future tense. This is where we need to, because ferimus is present tense. You can see that right there. And so this one can be a little bit tricky if we don't know how to spell the word. And so this is where we want to make sure we're looking up our words in the dictionary, in this case, Whitaker's words. And you can see that's future active. So we need to make sure we put it in the future tense. So it, I'm translating as it, and then we will not tolerate it. In other words, Catilina, we will no longer tolerate your presence in the Roman Senate and in Rome. Tres vis recte vivere quis non. So here's a fairly straightforward one by Horace. S means you, so we should be familiar with that by now with our osmos tisnit. So O is I, S is you, T is he, she, it, mus is we, tis is you all, nunt is they. So you want to live rightly. Who does not? And so here they're giving us to help us learn the concept. So as we noted earlier, this is our base adjective form, us a and you can see the adverb in the predicate simply adds an e instead of an us a and then we just translate it with ly. So the book wants us to sort of make that conceptual shift in our own minds. That's why they don't just give us the adverb, but you can see that ends in e, whereas here this would be just your regular adjective, but we're using it with ly, or e in this case, which makes it an adverb. Adverb, of course, modifies the verb, whereas an adjective modifies a noun. So here we're modifying living. So you want to live rightly is how that reads. And then literally, who does not? So that one is nice. And it's also nice because it reminds us Latin doesn't use do or does. So literally, who not, right? But we need to say who does not. And so the verb is somewhat implied here. So number 3 is a good example of just the basic concept, which should be pretty easy given the simplicity of this example. As is often the case in language, it's the vocabulary that really is the challenge. If we don't know the vocabulary, it's not that we don't know the grammar, we just don't know the vocabulary. Again, Shakespeare is easy if you know the vocab. If not, it looks like a foreign language. Number 4, plus novisti quid faciendum sit. Plus means more. I mean, even in basic arithmetic, that's actually the word comes from Latin. So here we have isti. So what we have here is that you, I guess in this case, you want to know more, or rather, you know more than what ought to be done, is kind of how that works there. Or you knew more what must be done. So let me go ahead and write that out, and then I'll try to explain that. As often with the Wheelocks, we've said this several times, is in these lessons that the Wheelocks is kind of based, even though it works with an online format, it is actually better suited for the classroom because you have these classical sayings which are literary and philosophical and hence a little bit abstract. And the course is actually based on the idea that you have vigorous discussion in the classroom about the grammar and ideas. The format of the internet doesn't quite allow that flexibility. And so, once again, I'm going to give a rather literal translation of it. We can briefly talk about it given the limitations of the online format. But as always, you need to make it come alive in your own mind, as with most learning. So, you knew more is what plus novisti means. As always, right, if we're not sure of that, let's take our time. And you can see this one doesn't allow you, this is Latin for you. It doesn't, even with this, you have to sort of decipher and be able to analyze what's going on here. But Yeah, here's a better example of it. So novisti, so here's our perfect active indicative second person singular. And so it's you, but then it's perfect, so we got to put it in the past tense. And so then we need to decide which one of these meanings best fits the context. And most generically, you knew or you know if it's present tense is going to work here. And then going back to the original Latin, literally what is to be done. So let me write that down, then I'll try to explain that. This is an example of the gerund, which we've had before, the ND. This doesn't readily translate into modern idiomatic American English. And so, but the idea should be clear is that somebody, like most things, you know what you have to do, but for some reason we don't do it. It's not a question of knowledge, but a question of will, which is one of the big differences between ancient thought and modern thought. Modern thought, with technology and science, is very rational. In fact, in many cases, overly rational, whereas it doesn't seem to have a theoretical and practical understanding of will or agency, and hence the great discrepancy, for example, between the internet and most people's actual knowledge that the internet presumably reveals to individuals. There's a big gap between self-knowledge and scientific knowledge, and the gap seems to be getting larger and larger, in my view. The ancients, clearly they had an idea of knowledge. In fact, the word knowledge itself comes from Greek and Latin, but the ancient world was much more based on what you did, who you were, your character, and your abstract knowledge, although important, if divorced from character, somehow was seen as problematic for right living. And that's sort of the sense of this. And here's, and these other examples, and too, in fact, the entire ancient world. In the Christian context, the idea of original sin clearly is not one of knowledge per se, but rather one's will, one's character, one's heart, one's soul, however you want to look at it. That was the problem, is that it wasn't what we knew, but what we did that took us further away from God, according to many famous early Christian theologians and writers. And so I know that's a rather broad context, but that's sort of the sense of the grammar. Grammar is not something that is separate from knowledge and society and the time in which people speak the language, but rather are co-relational. And so we need to have that broad theoretical matrix in our minds in order to be successful with classical languages in particular, and even this otherwise trivial grammatical gerundive, with that knowledge that might give us a better sense of the meaning of the original Latin. So you knew more than you needed to know, but for some reason, what you should have done, but the sense is maybe you didn't do it, right? Now, remember, I mentioned before that Terence actually was a comedian, so in the original context, his stories often revolve around slaves and their masters or their owners, and the slaves are always trying to trick one another in order to ingratiate themselves with their masters, and the masters often, aren't in the loop, if you will, of what their slaves are doing. And that kind of play is what brings about the comedic effect in Terence's writing. So it may not have, a more serious meaning than other than somebody knew they were supposed to do something and they didn't do it, and maybe they got punished for it, perhaps. Number 5, mihi vere dixit quid velit. So here's one of our new verbs in our chapter. And here it is right here in our vocab as well, and it means to wish. Now the velet, this is where we need to look up our Whitaker's words. You can see this could be either the future active or the imperfect active subjunctive. And so this is where only the context will tell us. This is one of the tricky parts in Latin, is only the context will tell us if it's present, past, or mood, and so what mood it is, and so forth. But we have a clue here because the verb in the main clause is in the past tense. So that tells us that we need to put the this verb also in the past tense. So we put all together is that he literally said to me truly what he wanted. So let me go ahead and write that down, and then I'll try to explain that further. So this one's fairly straightforward. So dixit, he told to me, or he said to me. Here's our vere. So here is an adverb, ends in E. Older English, for example, verily, verily I say unto thee. And so it kind of came from the Latin. And then quid simply means what. And then you could say what he wished for, but if we go back to our possibilities here, we're just going to choose one, wish, want. And so what he wished for, but then if we say wish for, then we have to add that extra word. So let's just keep it more precise, what he wanted. So that one's fairly straightforward, I think. And it has both the adverb and one of the new verbs in this chapter in this particular example. Pares, which I believe is another vocabulary word. Yep, so here we go. So where we get pars, pares, equal. Now, we've had enough Latin at this point to say, okay, if the singular is par and the genitive is is, I got our Whitaker's, or rather our declensions here, that tells us it's third declension. So par, paris. But the verb, not the verb, but the noun here is pares, which tells us it is nominative plural. So we need to be able to make that conceptual move in our minds at this point. And so what it means is equals. So we'll just pluralize that. So equals with equals literally are gathered. This is where we get the word congregation. So you could even say are congregated together quite easily. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down, and then I'll explain it a little bit further. So two birds of a feather flock together is sort of the sense here. Quite easily, very easily. Notice that in my translation, I took out the passive and simply made it indicative. So the nuntur is passive, but as we've seen before, we can simply put it in the regular indicative. So instead of saying equals with equals are being together, or excuse me, are being gathered together, quite easily we can just, I think, in more idiomatic American English in the 21st century, equals with equals gather together quite easily. So I'll put that are being, just so you can see the side by side. So this actually is closer to the original Latin because we have the passive, but we're translating it into English, and so we can, in one sense, take this nuntur or passive ending and simply put it in the indicative. So that one's also fairly straightforward once we know our vocab. And then there is our adverb. Cum is always followed by the ablative, so third declension. Ablative plural is ibus, so cum paribus. And so once we know our vocab, this one also, I think, is fairly straightforward. Number 7, so literally, you more than eyes my I love. So, you more than eyes my I love. I love you more than my eyes. What does it even mean? Well, let's write it down first so we have that to consider. So I've already made that interpretive shift because then my eyes myself doesn't make any sense in English. I love you more than my own eyes. Even this one is very literary. What does that even mean? Well, let's talk about some of the grammar points first, too. So here we have the comparative magis, which is in our book here. See if I can readily find it. Yeah, right here. So more, indicating quality. And then we also have the quam, which also is another grammar point noted in your chapter. Let's go back here and show it to you. So here's the quam. And it's used in adverbs to indicate more. And so we have that as well, making a comparison. And then the rest of it is just knowing vocab, which we've had in earlier chapters. Oculos meos, we should recognize at this point as second declension, accusative plural. Te, we've had many a times, simply the accusative form of tu, or you. So I love you more than my eyes. Now, what does that even mean? Is that, well, I think if you think about it, the meaning's fairly clear. Is love is not merely external senses, but an internal or inner sense. And so the inner sense is different than the outer sense, just as the inner is different than the outer, or the physical is different than the spiritual. And so the dualisms in ancient thought are arguably another difference between the ancient world and the modern world. For example, the gods and man was a cardinal distinction for the ancients, whereas we tend to have these distinctions, but not really. We tend to live in a rather one-dimensional, hermetic universe where everything is kind of the same. It's a kind of pantheism or mysticism in philosophical terms. But that's neither here nor there. But I think if you recall that distinction between the inner and the outer, and beauty as physical versus beauty that's spiritual or based on human emotion, the meaning becomes not only clear, but perhaps important to think about. All right, moving on here to number 8. So here we have men free then think what want. This one's actually Caesar right here. So men freely believe that what they want. So let me go ahead and write that down, and then I'll try to explain it in greater detail. So the idea here is, in fact, they give us a better, so let me change this to willingly, just to be freely, of course, can, or libenter can mean freely, but in Caesar's case, let's go with willingly. What does that mean? Well, people want to believe what they want to believe. And so Caesar knew that. Again, just to be a little bit provocative, he was a dictator, he was a manipulator, all the things that we associate with Caesar. But at the end of the day, he moved history. And why did he move history? Well, because most people, right, are easily, credulously, right, made to do things not based on foresight or wisdom or any great moral virtues. Is they're seeking the path of least resistance, in this case pleasure. You give people pleasure, candy, bread and circuses, all the things that we're familiar with in our study of ancient literature. You can control men. Modern man, give him money and he'll do anything for you. And so Caesar, who was not a great psychologist in one sense, knew how to get people to do what he wanted them to do, because in a kind of unconscious way, through his own experiences, he knew what moved men, in this case, appealing to their pleasures. So men believe that easily what they want. All right, number 9, multa inveniunt hominibus quae volunt et quae nolunt. And so, literally, much happens, I guess, to men what they want and that which they don't want. And so many things happen to people, both what they want and what they don't want. So the tricky part in this one is the multa, which is functioning as a kind of noun in this case, as it's the subject. So many things come about to people. So let's go ahead and write that down first. So just to expand on this, so many things or much, and then they tell us what this means. I guess they said you could say happens to, but I'm just going to keep the come about, even though it's in quotation marks and not italics. So many things happen or come about to people or to human beings, what they want and what they don't want. I'm going to put a comma here just for clarification. What's the idea in that? Well, many things kind of following this theme here is people are not consciously aware of cause and effect in any strict sense. Things kind of happen. It's kind of day to day, kind of trial and error. And so, but the idea that somehow that human beings are acting and living based on some pure volition in concordance with the order of things, well, that doesn't seem to be the case according to this maxim. Number 10, what's tricky about this one perhaps is we need to know what the subject is. And in this case, it's mus. So we are able, so literally, with plan, better to contend and conquer, we are able than anger. So even though it sounds a little bit wonky, I think it is helpful when you're first learning Latin, or when you're always learning Latin for that matter, is just to get a sense of the vocabulary and just read it left to right like we're accustomed to in English. So plan, better to contend, and also to conquer, we are able than anger. So we are able, let's write that down first for possimus. And then contendere, we are able to contend we are able to contend. Now, let's see if they give us another option for, that is our infinitive, but it just sounds a little bit, oh, so here, yeah, so we are we're able to, when this readily doesn't help us too much here, to contend, compete. So this loses a little bit in translation, but let's go with one of those. I'm just going to keep it contend because that's literally what contendere means. The idea is still clear, is that with some kind of problem or adversity, you need to overcome it in some way. And so the idea here is that we're able to do so better so with a plan that's based on reason and deliberation than being angry. So the idea is fairly clear, even though the grammar is a little bit tricky in this case, perhaps. We're able to contend and conquer. Let me get my adverb in there. Better with a plan than with anger. So Melios is our, go back here to our chart. I think they have this one here somewhere. Right here. Yep. So there we go. So bene melios optime. And so melios means better. So there's our comparative adverb. And then the rest of it is just knowing the vocab. So we're able to contend and conquer better with the plan than with anger. The concilio, the ablative, is always the hard part. And so, because remember, concilium is the nominative. But if I change that to concilio, then it puts it in the ablative, and then we translate that as with a plan. All right, just a couple more here. Hope you're having a good day. Slowly waking up, drinking my coffee. Sun is coming out. Let's see. Optimos quisque facere mavunt quam dicere by Salus. We haven't had a lot of Salus. Here they're giving us a little tip. It means more than he wants. So this is how we're going to translate this mavunt. Remember, malo means to prefer. So if we go back to our vocab here, malo means to prefer, but then they're also combining it with a form of wanting. And so they're kind of, this kind of an interesting word here. So quisque means each person. So this one's tricky because we got to figure out, okay, who's the subject, right? So I guess in this case, each person, I guess it is best that if each person does what he wants, then actually, let me see here. So this one's a little bit tricky. So each person is better. This one's, let me, quisque, everyone is best to prefer to do something than to say to do something. Let me go ahead and write this down and then work my way through this one here. So each person, or maybe let's try, sometimes each one could be quisque. So each one is best when he does something each one is best, or each person, everyone is best. I'm going to change that into everyone. Everyone is best when he does something rather than when he just says something. Yeah, this one is tricky because it seems like we're missing a lot of words, but that's how I'm going to read it here, because what we have is best everyone to do more than he wants than to say. All right, and so This one just is a little bit tricky, and that's the way the Wheelocks often is. As you get deeper into the exercises, there's a couple that are a little bit abstract, and then that's just the nature of Latin. A lot of times, the more advanced you are, it feels like you're missing words, and then you have to kind of decipher and intuit and create the sense of it. But that's the way I'm going to go with right here is everyone is best, and that's going to be quisque optimus, so everyone is best. And then facere mavult, I'm reading that, so I'm adding a when in there, when he does something rather than, and then the Latin just has dicere, but if you say just rather than speaking, actually that might work too, rather than. So basically, the idea is deeds, not words. Everyone is best when he does something rather than speaking, rather than. I'm going to put a just in there just to make it more idiomatic. So that one's a tricky one. Number 12, omnes sapientes felicator perfecte fortunate vivunt. So literally, all wise men are happy. Literally perfectly, but maybe completely or fully. And then they live happily, I guess, in that case. So all wise men. Oh, I see. Okay, so they're using three. Okay, so all wise men live, vivunt. So omnes sapientes vivunt. So let's write that first. So all wise men live. And then we just have a series of three adverbs. So all wise men live happily, completely, and literally fortunately. Do they give us a different word for that? No. Fortunate, because fortunately sounds a little bit weird in English. The idea must be, so we're going to go with fortunately. I think this is in the context of Cicero's Stoicism and the idea of fortune or chance or fortuna. And part of Stoic philosophy was to put fortune or adversity or bad luck into its larger cosmic perspective and kind of roll with the punches, if you will, and not to be overly alarmed if fortune doesn't blow your way all the time or even often, but rather recognize that that's just the way it is, but it's not the things that disturb us, but our judgments and assessments of them, to cite a famous Stoic maxim. And so that's sort of the sense here, is they're sort of living in tune with fortune. And because when we have bad luck, it can affect our moods and hence our sense of life. And the ancients didn't have a clinical diagnosis of depression, but clearly they were human beings. And so life isn't always fair. Life isn't fortunate. And Stoicism was the Roman way, philosophically speaking, of overcoming and coping, with life's adversities. So that's the sense of it. And so let's go ahead and write that down. So all wise men live happily, completely, and fortunately. Last one for today. There's our maxime. So we'll go back and just to put this in context here. So this chart, I would have this open as you do the exercises because it's going to help you. They should have this one here. Oh, there it is, right? So this one be careful on this one because it ends in E, but it's not the positive degree of the adverb but the superlative. So we have to say most or especially is how we translate that one. So just using this chart and memorizing it is the way to go. So let's go with most or especially. Let's keep that in mind. So they praise him most, or right, who is not moved by money. So I'm going to write that one down. I think we've had something like this earlier. So they so by Cicero, so nunt is they, laudo, that goes back to chapter 1. Um, so they praise him most, or they praise him especially, who is not being moved, or is not moved, non movitur. So here's our passive again, but we could just say is not moved. And then pecuniae is first declension ablative singular, and then we translate that as by money. So we add the preposition by often with the ablative, and so by money. All right, that was it for today. And again, I hope you have a great day. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. But just to summarize, I think and admittedly, I'm a little bit clumsy going back and forth on this Kindle, but if you have this open in your book and use this as you work your way through the exercises and to just adopt the translation they give you, I think these are very doable, especially looking up the words and just kind of messing around a little bit with the word order. I think number, what did we say, 11 was probably the trickiest one. But again, hopefully the meaning is clear. And yeah, carpe diem.